Hello, everyone, and welcome to the series finale of the Left Book Club's Anticapitalism series with Gargi Bhattacharyya. We are very excited and actually feel like it's very fitting that the season finale, in a way, of this series and this quite popular series is on anti-capitalism and crime, something, a discussion and a topic and a area of work that seems ever more, obviously relevant, but also crucial to develop alternative perspectives on, and particularly to understand the organizing that's been done. But just a little bit about where this series came from. I think Gargi might be able to talk a little bit about the idea around this as well. But we started this series, the anti-capitalism series, in September 20. It came about after September 2020. We started it in September to December 2020, following the government's strategy and law around basically labeling anti-capitalism education material as extremists. So we developed this series called Who's Afraid of Anti-Capitalism to have discussions in how anti-capitalism relates to different areas in, society and politics and so on. And we've had series almost every month since December 2020, and this is the finale. Hopefully we get to do more of these, but in terms of this series, it's really exciting that we're also in some ways ending it on something so crucial. So we have some really exciting guests under one virtual roof today, and I'll talk a bit about who they are in a second. But my name is Elif, and I do the political education for the Left Book Club. The Left Book Club is a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative. We publish collectible editions of radical and progressive books, which are uniquely available to our members and posted out each month. We seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education, aiming to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps, with the goal of supporting the struggles fighting for us all. Our events, including this series, but not limited to, have featured some phenomenal guests over the months. So feel free to check out the video library to watch the previous events and discussions, which are events that engage with a wide range of radical thought. Tonight, don't forget to ask your questions on the YouTube live stream chat where you're watching us right now. If you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click Become a Member. Don't forget to follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep update with events such as this, promotions, and giveaways. And also, while you're here, just subscribe to the YouTube channel. This has never actually happened before, but if the stream does go choppy, just stay with us and we'll make sure to continue running as soon as possible. But it hasn't actually happened before, so I'm sure everything will be fine. So this final event of our popular anti-capitalism series with Gargi and guests, we're discussing crime. And we have Michael, Etienne, Scarlet, Harris, and Kevin Blowe for a discussion that has seemingly taken on new meaning in the last few months, with the revelations, which in some ways now seems kind of old news, considering some of the other revelations in more recent weeks around Partygate and the Trojan Horse affair and many other seemingly foundational revelations to some of the things that we're going to discuss today. So we'll be delving into the notion of crime, who gets to define it, criminal justice and its relationship to capital and alternatives to it. Gargi Bhattacharyya is one of the UK's leading scholars on race and capitalism. She is the author of Rethinking Racial Capitalism, Dangerous Brown Men, Traffic, and the co-author of Empire's Endgame. Scarlet Harris is an early career sociologist based in Manchester. She researches and writes on state racism, anti-racism, and left politics, and recently co-authored a report published by the Institute of Race Relations exploring police racism in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Kevin Blowe was a founding member of the Network for Police Monitoring, mostly known as Netpol, in 2009 and has been a staff member since 2014, becoming campaigns coordinator in 2021. Netpol's work highlights aggressive and racialized police tactics, intrusive police surveillance, the government's expansion of public order legislation and powers, most recently in the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill, and the increasing use of civil injunctions against protesters. Before working for Netpol, Kevin was a community centre worker and spent 5 years as a campaigner with the New and Monitoring Project in East London. Michael Etienne is a barrister focusing on actions against the state, particularly actions against the police and other detaining bodies such as mental health units and prisons. So without further ado, over to you, Gargi.
Thanks so much, Elif, and thanks for everyone who's making some time on this very politically busy evening to tune in. And if you're tuning in later, also welcome. And also, as Elif has said, that if you're finding this series for the first time, if you just search Anticapitalism and Left Book Club on YouTube, a whole array of lovely watching will come up for you, and that you can go back across things that we've broadcast before. As Elif's already said, that we couldn't have predicted how super timely this postponed event would be, that recent months have really drummed home, even to people who are not necessarily on the left, the extent to which the rich and the powerful are above the law. You know, if there's been a core debate in this country in recent weeks and months, it's been about that. But if we think of crime as a construct to entrap the poor, leaving the rich immune from the constraints of the law, how should we think about crime as anti-capitalists? And I think that is also a question that has been circulating around left and progressive circles for some months and years. That, you know, how do we deal with harm amongst ourselves? How do we deal with the very genuine fear of crime amongst people who should be our people in our own communities? How do we respond to the kinds of concerns that people might have about violent crime or about racist attacks or about sexual violence, all those things that do scar people's everyday lives and are wounds that we all, you know, our communities carry with them? And how do we imagine addressing concerns about crime, both now and in the future world that we hope to build? You know, what do we think is going to happen to that whole edifice of repressive state power if we start to build a better world? People are probably familiar with accounts of the law which show how the logic of the law has been so deeply involved in defending private property above all else, and that even if the individual person has any protections, it tends to be as if your person is your property, as if, you know, this is another bit of stuff I own. And of course, that leads to the non-protection or the under-protection or the active violation of those who are deemed incapable of owning themselves, and all kinds of systemic injustices can lead some other group of people to be put in that position of being incapable of owning themselves and any of the protections of law. So given that we operate in that kind of system, building alliances and with comrades who have that experience of the law being nothing but violence to them, I wondered if we could begin by thinking about how anti-capitalists might use the law, what kinds of use the law could be to us as anti-capitalists. And Kevin is going to kindly open with some thoughts on that question. Thank you.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, for me, I'm not an academic, and a lot of the work that we do is by necessity very practical. It's very much about, you know, the need to be able to respond to the immediate concerns that the groups that we work with are articulating. I think obviously one of the starting points for this in terms of this discussion is to recognise that things are different in different places. So a liberal capitalist society doesn't operate in the same way, for instance, as a dictatorship, and societies like Britain, France, Germany, and certainly the United States all operate in significantly different ways. I mean, that's part of the reason why some of the demands that came up from the US Black Lives Matter movement don't necessarily automatically translate into the same demands in other places. I mean, partly in Britain because of the nature of the way that the policing is funded. For instance, defund the police doesn't have quite the same meaning. But I mean, I think in general we can say that liberal capitalist societies tend to seek to. The difference between a dictatorship, I guess, is that liberal capitalist societies do tend to encourage citizens, customers, whatever you want to call them, to identify with it as participants. And so there is always, with the law, a certain amount of needing to find a way to accommodate the kind of basic human instincts that we have that see greed and cruelty and violence as being inherently wrong. There is also a sense that they need to convince us that the system is governed by laws, even if those laws are heavily weighted against the elites and against the powerful. In part because that's just a more efficient way under certainly a democracy for the defence of property rights. So it doesn't involve force, but it does involve a degree of acceptance and consent. Now, as we said in the introduction, the organisation that I've worked for a long time campaigns around oppressive policing, and so unsurprisingly, the issue that I want to focus on today is much more about the nature of policing within that discussion. When I've talked to people before about this, about what the police is actually for, I tried to describe policing as kind of primarily being around what we call the 3 Ps. So obviously property, which is something that Gargi talked about at the beginning, the physical and often very forceful protection of wealth and of business, of privilege, the idea that there is a favourable treatment for elites and for the powerful, and then the main area that NEPOL works on, which is public order, the maintenance of what the state broadly considers to be acceptable behaviour in public. And obviously, in particular, when that comes to protest, that also means protecting itself from the challenges to its own authority by force. Now, all those things apply to other areas, other kind of types of systems, dictatorships as well. But there is an impetus to try and convince the public to identify with the state. And that's why the police are always at pains to emphasise that they police by consent, that's central to their ethos. Of course, in relation to our approach to this, what consent means in that context is very heavily shaped by the media and by blatant government propaganda. And in many instances, the introduction of new police powers and new laws are unquestionably shaped by moral panics. I mean, you've seen that with the government's introduction of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. It's been the justification behind that legislation has been, about extremists within the environmental movement and thugs and hooligans within the Black Lives Matter movement. But primarily, the thing that really, really tipped it over for Priti Patel as Home Secretary was a perceived threat to business interests, in particular XR targeting the print works that covers some of the main papers that support the Conservative Party. So with all that in mind, our view is that, and it has always been, is that the law is essentially a battleground, and that human rights law in particular is the key battleground, which is, I guess, why the current Conservative government is so keen on trying to remove some of the constraints that exist within the Human Rights Act. In the work that we do, we kind of expect that the police will see human rights as being little more than a kind of a box that's ticked. Our expectation is probably also that it, other than exceptional circumstances, policing absolutely is above the law. And those exceptional circumstances come about because of resistance to oppressive policing, right? It's what we do that creates the space for those challenges. So unlike many liberal human rights organisations, NEPOL in our campaigning work has used national and international human rights guidance and laws, but not as some form of request to the state, but I guess as a means of confrontation. So if British policing says that it polices by consent and it understands and respects the importance of human rights, then where's the evidence? Why is it fewer and fewer people actually believe this? Why are the police actively lobbying for more draconian police powers? It's part of the reason why, in terms of approach that we made a couple of years ago when we started to work on how we push back against this, that we came up with the Charter for Freedom of Assembly Rights in relation to our work around protests, because it sets out a way that we believe that the police should treat protests, challenging them to, if they disagree with the proposals that we come up with, and our proposals is basically the police doing the absolute minimum, so they are going to disagree, with their own set of standards, which unsurprisingly, the senior levels of the police have absolutely failed to do. It's, I think, one of that's true for protests, but for other areas, I mean, it's unsurprising that from year on year, the police make promises about how they're going to deal with the disproportionality of stop and search as every new set of stats come out. And it's the pushback that has made them need to defend that. And it's actually the pushback that's forced this ridiculous situation now, where the police are essentially defending being disproportionate on the basis of that's necessary for knife crime. It's changed the debate. It is at least a little more honest, but it fundamentally begins to throw doubt on that notion that policing is actually about consent. So for me, I guess the answer to that question of what use can anti-capitalists put for the law, I think it's not necessarily having expectations that it will change things, but seeing it as a battleground that we can use. And maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. I thought that, that's really helpful and clear laying out of some of the issues that we hope we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to move quickly on to my next lovely guest, Scarlet, who's going to take the debate in a slightly different direction, but continue from where Kevin has left off.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Elif and Gargi for inviting me along this evening. Hello to everyone tuning in. I'm very excited to be part of this discussion with such kind of esteemed organisers and thinkers. I think what I want to talk about briefly, I'm hoping it will complement what Kevin has very usefully introduced us with. And I'm going to speak a bit more to the question of resistance as part of this broader discussion on anti-capitalism and crime, and specifically to anti-racism in this context, because that's kind of what I've tended to focus on as part of my academic work and organising as well. And I'm hoping that this will sort of self-evidently link into the question of how we respond to the law in an anti-racist way, but also an anti-capitalist way. So, as Kevin sort of has touched on in various ways, and as we all know, we're living in a moment of crisis, and we use that word all the time, don't we? Because it feels, I think, absolutely apt. And in Britain, we're living under what feels like an increasingly authoritarian, punitive state, where the space for coming together in radical ways feels sort of more and more squeezed, if not near impossible. In the context of a crisis in policing and a global health crisis in particular, it is of course essential to understand and kind of get to grips with the ways in which racism renders certain groups, to kind of paraphrase Ruth Wilson Gilmore, disproportionately vulnerable to state violence or to premature death. And some of the work that I've been involved in, which Elif kindly mentioned in the introduction, some of the work on policing and racism in the context of the pandemic has really demonstrated the ways in which lockdown conditions, new police powers, and also long-standing police practices have been mutually reinforcing in ways that have further criminalised those communities at the sharp end of policing, who are already at the sharp end of policing, I should say. Having said that, I'm hoping to inject a little bit of kind of hope into this discussion. And as the great Stuart Hall reminds us, every crisis is also a moment of reconstruction. And I think there's something else that we need to attend to in this context, which I see as a source of hope. So when the Black Lives Matter protests erupted in the midst of the pandemic in summer 2020, people were furious about police violence, institutional racism, as well as the racism exposed through the pandemic. But I also think that this sort of collision of crises engendered a broader sense of shared vulnerability to state violence. And maybe we could reframe this or rethink this in terms of a shared vulnerability to state crime or crimes of the state. Maybe this discussion will make me think about that more in those terms. We'll see. And at least from my perspective, this sense of shared vulnerability, I think went beyond racialized categories in some ways. And that's something I'm quite interested in, I suppose. So when I attended the main Black Lives Matter protest in Manchester, which is where I'm based, in June 2020, I was part of a small group in attendance who were distributing PPE. And it was a time when we still really didn't understand the virus at all. Thinking back, we were handing out hundreds of pairs of rubber gloves, as well as face masks. And we were sort of terrified that as people were taking these rubber gloves, they were going to contaminate them, and that would pass on the virus. Obviously, we know that virus works in kind of different ways now, but it's just a reminder, really, thinking back of how little we knew about the virus and what a scary time it was. And of course, lots of people at that protest hadn't been with other people for many months, never mind a big crowd of people. As others have pointed out elsewhere, and I think, Gargi, this was something that you mentioned on the Anticapitalism and Race session, part of the series. At least this part of the Black Lives Matter movement hasn't, well, I suppose many of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Britain have felt strikingly young and multiracial. And I also, I think this was something you said, Gargi, that this part of the Black Lives Matter movement hasn't felt like a case of what we might call sympathy solidarity. It's felt rather more like an expression of some sort of shared experience. I mean, we can discuss that further. And that for me was certainly how it felt in Manchester. There's something there that I think is hopeful and generative. And I think that sense of shared vulnerability to various forms of state violence is something that should be really harnessed and developed by those of us on the left in the current moment. I really like paraphrasing Gargi when they say that racial capitalism helps us to understand how we are all living shit lives, but in different ways. Hopefully that's a fair paraphrase. And I think viewing police violence through this same lens helps us to cultivate that sort of understanding of shared vulnerability, hopefully without collapsing some of those important distinctions and differences in experience as well. I don't know, I try not to ramble too much longer, but I suppose the connections between different forms of vulnerability were, revealed even more starkly as well with the murder of Sarah Everard, who we now know was kidnapped and killed by a serving police officer, who not only abused his position as a police officer, but also explicitly used COVID regulations in that abduction. And I think groups like Sisters Uncut and the Kill Bill Coalition have done a really good job at getting that message of shared vulnerability across. And also, just to touch on what Kevin was saying, through that idea of the police don't keep any of us safe, and therefore we need to withdraw our consent at this stage. I'd be interested to chat more about that message. got loads more to say about stuff that's happening in Manchester that I think is really exciting and drawing on some of those ideas, but maybe you can save that for the chat. I'll just end with a bit of a reflection on the recent strikes that, as people will hopefully know, lots of us are on strike at the moment, this week, next week. We were also on strike in December in the university sector, higher education sector. And anyway, I was part of a teach out in December as part of these strikes. And one of the teach outs was about abolition and police abolition. And it was brilliant. It was very well attended. And I was just really buoyed by the sorts of discussions that students were engaging in, actually. I'd kind of gone in there facilitating this discussion with a set of questions that were about, well, you know, how do we understand safety? What does safety mean to people? And actually students were miles ahead of me. They were going straight in with, we need to abolish psychiatry. You know, they were miles ahead. And I think this sort of vocabulary of abolition is one that I don't think I had access to 10, 12 years ago as an undergraduate student. And I think it's a vocabulary and a framework which enables us to connect the dots between different experiences of violence and specifically police violence and the violence of the wider criminal justice system. And I suppose it allows us to begin to unsettle some of those hegemonic ideas about what policing is for, and hopefully ultimately persuade people about what we think is the role of the police and the wider criminal justice system is. And I think I'll leave it there.
There now, thanks so much for that, Scarlet, and thank you for pulling those things together. And you're quite right. One of my catchphrases is that racial capitalism teaches us that we're all living shitty lives, but just differently shitty lives. So we don't have to be the same. And I think you're right that we're living through some movement in just kind of a recognition of the different violences of the state and of capital that enables something which I think wasn't possible in this country 10 years ago. But my third equally lovely guest, Michael, I hope is going to come in now. And thank you so much for taking time as well to all three of you, because people should know all three of our speakers. You've got plenty of other things to be doing, but it's going to add to the discussion now. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Gargi, and it's genuinely a pleasure to be on the panel. When I got the invitation, I didn't hesitate to say yes, so no thanks needed for me, only out to you and the team at the book club. For anyone who doesn't know, I am a barrister, notionally probably representing individuals in actions against the state of various kinds. So that's my sort of grounding in this conversation from a professional point of view, but obviously also have lots of relevant lived experiences that touch on some of the issues that Kevin and Scarlet and Gargi have touched on already. I wanted to start with a quote that I found in the introduction to an article called Law as a Capitalist Technique by Alistair Hudson. And I think it touches on some of the points that Kevin was making in his introduction. And it's under the subtitle Law as the Enabler of Capitalism. And I think this is worth, certainly as a lawyer, reflecting on the question of how, as anti-capitalists, we can use the law, if we can at all. And he says this: law is not an accidental byproduct of capitalism, nor is it a distinct social system operating in parallel to capitalist economics. Rather, law is central to capitalism. Law is the means by which capitalism gets its work done. Without quiescent legal systems and a quiescent cadre of lawyers skilled in everything from corporate reorganizations to the manipulation of trust assets, modern capitalism could not exist in its modern form. This modern form of capitalism is a newer form, dubbed ultra-capitalism. Which uses corporate lawyers to bleed value out of companies, to avoid regulatory oversight and to dodge liability to tax. This ultra-capitalism is not capable of redemption, but is in urgent need of a profound conceptual revolution. It's through a non-capitalist non-capitalist models of commercial enterprise, like the cooperative, that balance can yet be restored to the economy and to our law. I think that's interesting because one of the conflicts I have quite a lot is this kind of question in my mind, which someone who was also a lawyer put to me a little while ago is, to what extent in doing what we do and, insisting that we can use the law as a means to an end, are we enabling the continuation of the system? What's interesting to me in the paragraph I just read out, and it's only the introduction, but the focus is very much on the obvious form of capitalist lawyers, right? People working in corporate enterprises for, the increase of profit. But I think that all of us as lawyers have to think about the extent to which we're contributing to the system, because actually, capitalism depends on control. And so that means those of us who are involved in the criminal justice system in whatever aspect also are playing some role in an important function of capitalism, right? Which is not just the reproduction of capital and the focusing of capital in fewer and fewer hands, but also controlling those who would be workers, right? And requiring them and mandating them to behave in certain ways in order that they can be controlled. And, we saw some of that at the start of the pandemic, people forced to go to work. At the height of the pandemic in March 2020, people in those groups who predictably were amongst those most disproportionately affected by the fatal consequences of COVID-19, people who typically lived in, forms of housing that aided the spread of COVID, whilst people who lived in leafier parts of the country had less to fear, in some respects at least, from the virus. So, I come to the law kind of quite cynically in lots of different respects. But ultimately, I think it is a means to an end. But I think we have to wrestle with the reality that the legal system as we know it is inherently capitalist. And on one level, there are these inconsistencies, right? We're supposed to be living in a democratic, human rights focused democracy, state. And yet we can have police repression on the violent scale that we've seen in Bristol, that we saw in the policing of the Black Lives Matter protests in London, as we have seen historically in the policing of our Black and brown communities in Tottenham, in Birmingham, in Solihull, wherever it is. It is those contradictions, I think, can probably potentially be resolved by thinking about the fact that the rights that we apparently enjoy are often subject to an acquiescence to the capitalist consensus. So you can enjoy all of these rights in lots of very important, powerful ways. I'm not diminishing the value and protection that they offer, but you can enjoy them much more freely as long as you're not using them to push against the status quo. And as soon as you use your rights to protest, as soon as you use your rights to withdraw your labour, you'll have the police knocking on your door at 4 a.m. You'll have your pensions being attacked. You'll have your workers' rights increasingly reduced, whilst the freedom of corporates to act in the way that they do is largely untouched. And I agree with Kevin when he says that there is a battleground in relation to human rights. But again, I am a human rights lawyer, and I believe in the notion of protecting the rights of individuals. But there is something about a lot of certainly the liberal narratives around human rights law, which gives a veneer of credibility to lots of forms of state violence. And for me, it often gets summed up in this fixation without any real critical analysis of the notion of the rule of law, right? The idea that justice is done as long as the processes are completed, irrespective of the outcome. you know, that for me at base level is essentially what the rule of law notion is. You know, as long as justice is done and it's seen to be done, that's the most important thing. Well, that isn't the reality, and that way of focusing on what is or isn't justice perpetuates injustice, right? Bakes injustice into the system because it makes it impossible, in the eyes of many people, to critique what happens in the law and in the courts, because everybody wants to say, well, someone's been tried, they've had their evidence, they've had their day in court, they've been convicted. You know, so I think you have to be alert to these challenges and try not to get too caught up in this idea of, you know, the rule of law and the inherent superiority of our human rights norms. You know, even a lot of the rights and protections we have are still economically focused. Right? The Human Rights Act has made lots of really, really important inroads into this. But fundamentally, we don't have, for example, big systems of comparable socioeconomic rights. We get them piecemeal, the minimum wage, the living wage, fine. But there are lots of other forms of socioeconomic rights we don't have. And the reason we don't have them in an enforceable system in the way that we have, for example, under the Human Rights Act, is because that would be too expensive. Think of all the arguments you hear against the living wage and everything everybody said about the minimum wage. So we are operating within a system that is inherently in favour of capitalism, and we will not have a system that is anything like what we would want without fundamental change to the structures of our society. And as long as we recognise those are the boundaries in which we are taking on these challenges and taking on these battles, then there is hope. And I want to end on the point of hope, really, because, you know, I sometimes come away from having conversations about my views on law and politics thinking, oh, I don't want everyone to feel depressed. There is real momentum at the moment, and Scarlet touched on it. I'm also involved in Hackney Cop Watch, and cop watch groups are springing up all over the country, thanks in part, no doubt, to the excellent work that Kevin's doing in producing guidance for cop watch groups and community organising, where ordinary people are wanting to understand their basic rights in relation to police accountability and what the police can and can't do. I was speaking at a Know Your Rights workshop at the Dalston Solidarity Cafe a couple of weeks ago, Saturday afternoon. Turned up. There were about 150, 200 people in there. And I had to assume that they weren't all there for the workshop. I've done Know Your Rights workshops in plenty of places. And if you get 20 to 30 people, you think you've had a good turnout. And there were hundreds of people there. And, you know, there are weekly meetings at cop watch groups, certainly around London. I can only really speak to London because I'm in London. You know, people do want to know what they can do to help others. And one thing that I think did come out of the pandemic that has been really, really powerful are mutual aid groups. You know, communities coming together to provide for each other in the absence of any framework of the state to do that, right? And that's really, really powerful. And some of the organising that's now going on in relation to the Policing and Crime Bill, in relation to the Borders Bill, people's interest in Know Your Rights, is coming out of groups that organise collectively to provide mutual aid. And having done that, they want to see where next we can go. So there is momentum and there is hope. It takes organisation, determination, and commitment. And I'm really glad to be able to contribute to a discussion space like this, which I think is an important part of that conversation.
Thanks so much for that, Michael. Sorry, I was having some trouble unmuting myself. And I hope everyone who's been before knows that we're not about hopelessness here, but it's about know the beast. You have to know the beast to slay the beast. And I think, as everyone has said, that the liberal propaganda for capitalist law is quite a big part of the beast. You know, the idea that there is a process and a way that our interests can be defended there. But I wanted to go on to a kind of the next question that in different ways all three of you touched on debates about police abolition and defunding the police, and the ways in which we seem to be living through a sea change in what is speakable about critiques of mainstream state institutions and the continuum of violence between state institutions. If we think of, on the one hand, that capitalism only sees the crime of people without things, but on the other hand, that capitalism kind of unleashes crime without end, that capitalism is a system of dispossessing living beings of their life force, everything that we might own in common: water, air, time, our lives, our ability to live. Every resource that humans and other living things might need is stolen away and repackaged by capitalism, often through very violent means, as all three of our speakers have talked about. I wonder if we might think a little bit about the other side of abolition, which is what repair would be. I mean, I think a lot of the debates about abolition have been, on the one hand, no more of this, but on the other hand, what would it mean to seek redress? Well, not redress is not often part of it. So I did want to ask about, do we want redress? And what might repair mean? And are there ways that there's a legal framing of that? Or what could we ever do about the crimes of capitalism, I guess? It's kind of an enormous question. I'm going to ask it anyway, and I'm going to start with Kevin again, I hope.
Wow, that's a big question, isn't it? I mean, I think it's a difficult one to know how to answer, because I guess, I mean, I come from a perspective which is a little bit more skeptical and a little bit less engaged with some of the abolitionist ideas that I've heard, and I think that's partly because, I mean, there's that old adage, isn't there, that how can you tell the difference between a Marxist and an anarchist? Ask them whether they think they think theory or practice is more important. And so much of what we do, as I mentioned earlier, is about the practical, is about the now. It's about responding to the immediacy of what the situation is. I mean, in terms of understanding that this is probably going to be a process, I think the starting point probably would be to understand that crime is at least in part about demoralized communities, about people who live in poor conditions, that overwhelmingly affects poor working class and racialized communities, that it is therefore, it's not necessarily something which affects everybody, certainly isn't something which affects everybody equally. And so therefore the first steps are, in terms of the redress, if I understand what you're saying, Gargi, is that there will be things that we do that may well be framed as being, by some people, as being reformist. So, you know, it's demanding the state takes action against racist violence was something that I spent a long time doing, and putting demands on for action from the state and from the police. The same is true for domestic violence. Certainly, in the decade that I spent as a secretary and administrator for the United Families and Friends campaign, a lot of it was placing demands on the state to prosecute officers who were responsible for deaths in police custody. I think that the common thread maybe for all of those is that what you have here is that the process of making those demands is people insisting that they not be treated as second-class citizens, and therefore the redress, if you like, is trying to seek that form of making sure that, even though the expectations might be that the state is not going to do it, and believe me, I've been to enough, you know, coroner's inquests and court cases and everything else to know that victories don't come anywhere near as often as you'd hope. What's happening here is that people are making demands which are about not being ignored. And the reason I mention, I guess, that is relevant is because if that's a positive thing, it also leads you into making sure that we exercise enormous amounts of caution about the kind of proposed forms that are put forward that don't come from communities under attack or from bereaved families, the kind of proposed kind of reforms which are, oh, we just need more black police officers, oh, we just need more women police officers, oh, we just need there to be more community leaders on a panel at a local level, not least in part because those proposed reforms have been tried over and over again over the 25 odd years that I've been involved in this stuff, and have failed every single time, but because they are not actually making a difference to the basic issue, which is that crime is disproportionately experienced by people who are also the biggest losers out of capitalism. So I don't really have an answer, to be honest, other than that. It's a really difficult one to know how to be able to say that there's an end point that we can get to. I think it's going to be a process of pushing back against the state over many years.
No, thank you so much. And part of what you're saying was, stuff that I hope you'd talk about the ways in which, as you say, in the last 30, 40, beyond our lifetimes years in this country and in other places, community campaigns against state violence have sought to use the master's tools, because what can you use to get even the register of the wound that has been put, your loved one's loss or the violence you've faced, where else can you register it? And I wonder if there's something about redress and repair which requires us to think about how the violence can be registered. Abolitionism talks quite rightly about the need not to punish and to have forgiveness in our politics, but not to punish is not to forget, because the dehumanizing processes, that is the cumulative crime of capitalism, really. But anyway, it's not meant to be about me. I'm hoping Scarlet might have a thought to say next.
Yeah, wow, brilliant and big question. I think just picking up on something that Kevin said about kind of, theory and practice, I suppose. And I suppose I'm inclined to sort of defend abolitionist politics a little bit, and make the point that it's, police abolition isn't just, I'm sure everyone would agree with this here, but I think it's still worth saying that police abolition isn't just about utopian futures, and envisioning utopian futures. It really is also about the here and now and practices of redistribution, of care, of resistance, and very tangible practices that can happen in communities and in local places that speak to abolitionism as a process, rather than just a utopian end goal, I suppose. And that sort of abolitionist practice might be campaigning to prevent more police officers being put in schools, which was a proposal in Manchester, and the No Police in Schools campaign led a really successful campaign to prevent that happening, to prevent more police being put in schools. And to me, that's part of an abolitionist politics, actually, because it's about not only about reducing the harms of the police, but it's also about asking for alternatives, or raising questions of, how do we address harms in alternative and preventative ways. And I think there's something that I feel I'm rambling, but there's something that my colleague Patrick Williams, who I'm sure some of you will know, legendary Patrick Williams, always says, which I think is one of those moments that clicks for people when he says it, which is that, when the police arrive, harm has already been done. When the police arrive to a crime scene or whatever, the harm has already been done. So the question needs to be, well, how do you prevent that harm happening? Because the police are not only not preventing the harm happening, but they're increasing the harm. So I think often that idea of I think that's just a bit of a light bulb moment sometimes, that we need to think about the preventative work, and I suppose that is that speaks to your question, Gargi, of redress and alternatives, I suppose. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but
no, absolutely. I'm going to abuse the chair again and say a little bit more before bringing Michael in. But I think there's two sets of questions, aren't there? There's a set of questions which are quite central to how people are speaking to each other about, if not this fake justice, defense of property, organized violence in our communities, what? So that's the alternative to policing. But then I think there's also an additional question I want to raise, which is, given that we have all lived through the intensive harms of capitalism, but differently, different shitty things happening to us, but this woundedness, this is in our collective psyches, in our community histories, what might we start to think about doing? I'm not saying even that, I kind of just want to even say the question, because I feel like, that is a political question for all of us, but I should let Michael say something more informed than I can say it, then move on.
I mean, I can say something more, Gargi. I'm not sure how informed it will be. I'll let others decide, especially as I'm not an academic. I think the first thing I'd say is, to answer your first question, Gargi, is there is no singular answer to the question of, if not this, what? And it tends to be, that sort of question tends to be deployed by people as a gotcha question, right? People say, right, okay, well then what do you want? And how are you going to deal with this? And how are you going to, and they want answers to absolutely everything immediately. And there is no singular answer. And in many respects, there isn't an immediate answer. But given that the alternative response is the status quo, I don't personally think that's much more convincing. It feels safer in the sense that we are more familiar with it, and change is disconcerting and unpredictable and uncertain. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue it. All I would say, I think, is that fundamentally, we need to move away from carceral systems. We have a proliferation of carceral systems in places where they didn't really exist in quite the visceral way that they do now. And my reference point for that is schools and school exclusion processes. The way in which schools approach so-called discipline replicates more and more and more the prison system and the policing system. And, I think that we can start with some work on alternatives by looking at those sorts of areas where we've had this entirely predictable mission creep. We talk about managing children's behaviour instead of supporting children with needs. You have the use of isolation in the same way that you see in the language of prisons. And Scarlet touched on it with the campaign to resist policing in schools. It is frightening to me that we have a system where police officers are stationed in schools. And I say that not just kind of as an empty rhetorical point. I've been on cases, I've seen cases where having police officers in schools predictably has not helped the child who ultimately ends up being excluded. Parents who have gone to schools to ask them for help and support and found themselves on the wrong end of an exclusion decision. And you see the same reactionary responses in that context. I think we have to make more demands of non-carceral solutions. And the point that you made at the start of this segment about the ways in which people can register their harms is undoubtedly the case that if you have been wronged, you want that harm to be, you want that wrong to be registered. You want some form of recompense for that. And it makes complete sense to me that families, particularly those families bereaved by the state, and others would want the state to recognise them, because that's the system in which we live, right? It also goes back to using the law as a means to an end. I mean, one thing is, if the status quo tells us that this is a values-rich system and everybody's equal, then let's call it out. I think Kevin mentioned it earlier. But I mean, a lot of that is also because we're not rich in alternatives at the moment. So, you know, there are lots of people who wouldn't want to have to go through all of these processes, which by and large you go through for months and years and decades and end up giving your life up to and get next to nothing at the end of it. Or worse still, you think you've got something, you think you finally secured a big victory that's going to change it for others so that others don't have to follow you. And you find out, lo and behold, a few years later, it's been forgotten and everybody's moved on. So, you know, we need to be bold and brave, and we need to be able to offer solutions that people can have trust in going forward.
No, absolutely. And I think, and in some ways, you know, as you've touched on, the process of trying to seek at least recognition through the law for many people becomes the next round of violence, doesn't it? Both in a targeted way, in the ways that people become monstered and suddenly the cops come up at your door because you're taking the cops to court, but then all this other wounding happens. I think I'm going to miss out one of my questions. I wanted to ask a differently framed question, or raise a differently framed issue that, well, I'll combine them. On the one hand, I think that bizarrely, certainly in Britain, I know Britain is a particularly kind of bootlicking kind of society, that people who shouldn't have any material investment in the status quo kind of still over-identify with the interests of the super rich. You know, that we see that in this stuff about what tax should billionaires pay, and all this kind of stuff about, you know, don't touch the super rich, because one day I think I'm going to be one of them. And I think that has an impact on how people can hear who the criminal is, because even without property, people are kind of defending a property they don't even have, in that psychic connection with the super rich. But at the same time, we're seeing across the world, including here, but in lots of exciting ways in different places, different attempts to use the law against corporations by activists, certainly around land rights issues, around corporate harm, around environmental battles, or just a kind of way of like, how could you embody the capital as criminal? And I wondered if, just kind of wondered if you had any ideas about why that seems to be an opening possibility. You know, what's allowing that now? It's just kind of your opinion, really. I was going to start with Scarlet.
What's allowing that now? I think you're right to identify a shift, I think, in how, yeah, in how people understand I think you're right to identify that shift. I think that probably it's a combination of things that have facilitated that shift, that identification of, or that more intense focus on the crimes of the rich, let's say. And I think that's probably, my sense is that probably started with like the financial crisis, you know, in 2008 maybe, and some of the forms of protest that came out of that, you know, Occupy, I'm thinking of the whole 1% slogan, and the more of a focus on global banking and global finance and those sorts of institutions. And then I think events like, you know, Grenfell was, I think, a really key event as well, in terms of really exposing the violence of corporations and the state, and the relationship between the two. So I think some of those flashpoints, and then again, I think the pandemic as well is another shift in exposing those, I guess, broader contradictions of capitalism, and the ways in which the law is implicated in that. So I think those are the kinds of flashpoints that come to my mind. But I'd be interested to know what other people think about that.
Yeah, great, thanks. Michael, have you got any thoughts on this one?
Just briefly, I agree with everything that Scarlet said. I also think it's about mobilization and organization, and I think that those are things which can happen more easily and much more quickly in the kind of digital age, if you like. People are connecting over bigger areas, which makes challenging these sorts of issues which feel impossible so much easier. I'm kind of, I think I might be slightly less hopeful than Scarlet. I can look at Grenfell and say, yeah, Grenfell was an abomination, and everybody knew that it could happen, and the state did not do what it ought to have done. But here we are, all these years after Grenfell, and we still have high-rise buildings with wall cladding. We've still got arguments about private tenants having to pay for the removal of that, and the government being pushed and pulled to make that different. Very possibly still Grenfell survivors and relatives still homeless after the fire. And one of the big tricks of the status quo is to, in my opinion, more often than not, feign guilt and shame and say this will never happen again, just long enough for it to fall out of the wider public memory. It's so good at quelling that initial indignation that something has been allowed to happen. And then the pandemic comes along, and it has been great for things like mutual aid, as I was saying. As Scarlet points out, expose a lot about, the power of law and who gets regulated and not. But, we've got a Prime Minister sitting in Downing Street who was writing the laws and almost simultaneously breaking them. And, if that had come out during the height of the pandemic, and look, don't get me wrong, there are circumstances where people have to make certain decisions, right? Whatever the rules say. But that wasn't this situation. You've got the Prime Minister who's telling families that they can't meet over Christmas, that they can't go and visit friends and, a family in hospitals and care homes, while simultaneously breaking the rules. Now, if these stories had come out during the height of the pandemic in 2020, surely he would have to have resigned overnight. His position would be immediately untenable. But we're already at a stage where even the most horrific things that were talked about during the early parts of the pandemic, which is still going on, by the way, and still horrific for a lot of people, has moved on. And that pressure has dissipated. And there he is, still sitting there as we are on the precipice of another international conflict. So I started positively and ended negatively. But I think the key point for me is that organising and mobilising is something that can happen much more effectively, I think.
No, absolutely. Thanks so much. And Kevin, have you got some further thoughts on this?
Very quickly, I think it's important to acknowledge that capitalism has always been very good at polishing its own image. So there's always been that sense that, of kind of bigging up the super rich. And once upon a time, there were people would build libraries, and that would be enough. I think that the big change that certainly I think we can identify under neoliberalism is that quite often who the super rich are is now no longer clear. Right? They're invisible. Venture capitalist company, you don't even know the names of them. I think it's really interesting when spent a lot of time supporting opposition to the people that were organising against opposition to fracking in this country, who were battling against these sort of cowboy companies. And actually the real money behind them were big, massive global corporations. And so the ability to be able to take them on board was significantly more of a challenge than the people that the difficulties already had. I think the big difference from the past is also that we don't have anything like the same level of organised labour that we had, say, in the 1930s. Right, the trade union movement is so much weaker. So a combination of the kind of capitalism becoming more invisible in terms of its obvious targets, becoming more global, so more difficult to be able to organise around, and actually there not being already this well coordinated movement around labour. Labour in the sense of not the party, obviously, but actually something which is genuinely significant, is three of the big problems with this. And because organising this stuff is just an enormous amount of work. I mean, we all know that, and other people will know that as well. That if you're starting from a fairly low base, the expectations of what you can achieve inevitably have to be lower. Right? I mean, I have huge respect for people who are pushing, for instance, for the introduction of new laws on ecocide, right? I think that's a fantastic idea, but I do think they have an interesting challenge to work out about what they do if they actually succeeded. How do you make that stick in a system which is already designed to make it as difficult as possible for those institutions to be accountable? I mean, obviously, if you're an anti-capitalist, you have a kind of an answer to this, which is world revolution, but we're trying to keep it focused this evening, so maybe we won't go there. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
No, thank you so much. And also, I think, you're right that however much we might all recognise the need to articulate what ecocide is for the reasons of representation and registering that we've said, look what good have the laws about genocide done for people who are being killed. Such dreadfully, I feel terrible to say that, but it feels like, and what do we expect, given also that corporations are now seeking to collect the rights of the person to themselves and express and litigate against the harms to their own corporate selves. How will we do that? There's a question from the floor which it isn't the revolution question, but it kind of touches on the edge of it, which says that arguably elements of capitalism look like they're starting to collapse. And we might question about whether that's a bit of a feigning of capitalism as well, or saying, oh, I'm feeling very weak now, please don't fight me. But anyway, I'm not going to go into that. So do we need to talk about crime and post-capitalism, which is partly what I also was trying to stretch towards when I was trying to talk about redress? What are the dangers and the opportunities, e.g. fascism versus socialism, about and I think whether or not we think capitalism is collapsing, the kind of greater disorganization of capital at the moment, which, the invisibilization of corporate power that Kevin's talked about, the ways in which the pandemic has revealed how neglected many populations are, that capital is operating just by taking everything from us and neglecting us and say, oh, just die in the street. In that kind of context, how might we think about crime in an even more deregulated capitalism or in a collapsing capitalism? That's even harder than my questions, isn't it? And I was going to ask Michael first.
Gargi. Slightly out of my wheelhouse. I feel like Scarlet might be a better place than me to come in on this. But first of all, I don't agree with the premise, unfortunately, of the question. The reality is, like it might be in real trouble during the global financial crash in 2005. Since then, globally have been bailed out to the tunes of trillions of dollars and are doing all right. And we are partway through a pandemic that has been devastating. Whilst the super rich have got richer. So I'm not sure I agree with that. In terms of notions of crime, I think as has already been said, the notions of crime that we have at the moment are inherently based around capitalist priorities. One of the things that Kevin said earlier was that, the communities that experience the most crime are the ones that are least served by capitalism. But that's not an accident. That's the way that policing is predominantly is targeted. So I honestly don't know what it will look like. I think we have to have these conversations. We have to envisage it, because I agree that wherever there is a vacuum, there is a risk. And I think the question in the chat sort of referenced dangers and opportunities by contrasting fascism versus socialism, for example. Worry at the moment is that we're much more likely to tip over towards fascism than we are towards any kind of form of leftist economics, and that is partly because the system has done such a good job at breaking a lot of the core organising of the left as an economic unit. Right? Kevin touched on the unions. So we need to. There's a big repair job that needs to happen. We also have to reimagine what it is to be collective and organised in an age where labour doesn't look like it used to, and we're not experiencing life in that way, and that's a big challenge.
Thanks so much. And I don't know if there's a problem with your sound or whether it's on my end, but that's a bit broken. I'm going to ask Kevin to come in next, please. Thanks.
Well, I don't agree with the premise either. I think the idea that capitalism will collapse on its own is wrong. If it did, it would the devastation, the environmental devastation to the planet by that stage would be so terrible that there wouldn't be anything left for us to salvage. Basically, I think looking at the state of this government and what it's able to get away with, and the lack of resistance that there is, and the more work that needs to be done, is a point to the fact that we're now seem to be on the point of having a war as well. So in Europe, is that capitalism is actually in a very strong position still, right? There are inherent weaknesses there, but that if there are going to be changes, it's going to come from us. So I'm not sure that I know how to answer that question if I don't agree with the premise.
Thanks so much. I'm going to bring in Scarlet for her thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think I understood the question more in terms of conversations on the left, maybe about how we about crime beyond capitalism, or about the nature of crime separate from capitalism. So what I'm thinking of here is that there's many people on the left who in response to abolitionist arguments for in terms of police abolition or prison abolition, many on the left will say, well, what about the rapists, or there'll still be murderers and there'll still be rapists, even after capitalism, even under socialism, those very dangerous people will still exist, and we need to find a solution to that, and therefore that gets used as an argument in favour of keeping a lot of these structures that we currently have, even alongside conversations about socialist utopias and a complete overhaul of the economic system. Oh, but we'll still need prisons. We'll still need some form of policing. So that's more kind of how I read that question, about some of those conversations, and how we navigate that, how we respond to those. And yeah, I find those discussions difficult, but I also don't think we should be on the left, I don't think we should be giving any ground to those more to right-wing arguments on questions of crime and on questions of securitization and control and things, you know. So that's my 2 cents. But maybe I misinterpreted the question, or maybe I'm opening up a Pandora's box that we don't have time for. Who knows?
No, I think that's great, and I'm going to bring Michael back in a moment. I'm just going to say that I think because, you know, it's impossible to talk to a bunch of people broadly on the left and say, oh, is capitalism collapsing by itself, because that just gets all of our knickers in a twist. But I do wonder if there is something to a change in capitalist approaches to ordering space, so that we began by saying that law has been a way of maintaining certain kinds of social order, as if it wants us to be a worker, as if it wants us to be a citizen. But for large parts of the world, and even large parts of our society, there's a kind of tearing up of those certainties about, I don't care if you're going to be a worker, I don't care if you're going to be a participant, I'm just going to take your social goods, retreat the state, and leave you to fight it out. And if you look globally, there's a kind of ecocide is one version of that as well. So then that kind of raises some other questions about, even if capitalism is differently uneven, what do we do when people are longing for order, longing for the jackboot, because the chaos and the violence that their lives have descended into, that's a different kind of thing. But sorry, I think Michael had a point to make.
I just wanted to come back on one point that Scarlet touched on in terms of, you know, this idea, well, what do you do about certain types of criminals, right? And they always pick the ones that in our mind's eye are the scariest, right? Which we're most afraid of. And you know, that in itself is a means of control, right? And is a level of repression in terms of thought and debate. I just wanted to, this is not my idea, so I'm not taking any credit for it, but it's also worth, I think, reflecting on the extent to which some of those crimes are themselves products of capitalism, right? That's a question worth asking. To what extent are these crimes products of capitalism? You know, if you look at, let's take an example like shoplifting, right? Theft. I mean, if you have people stealing in order to meet their basic levels of subsistence because of the way in which the economy is structured, that is a consequence of capitalism, right? So if you have a differently ordered society, those sorts of crimes we can reasonably anticipate would not occur, and they certainly wouldn't occur in the same way that they do at the moment. And other forms of very serious crime, which, you know, there is an argument that they reflect the very condensed, very intense spaces in which we're all forced to live, because we're all kind of in these like conurbations that are really designed for like just getting us to work in the morning and getting us back again once we've done a day's labor. So I think there's a useful and important conversation to be had around that, which I will get into so that I know more about it. But I just thought it was worth flagging that up.
No, thank you so much. And I just want to, the person, of course, because some poor person who wrote the collapse of capitalism question is just sitting somewhere typing and has said, look, by the collapse of capitalism, I mean the complete separation of financial institutions and stock markets from the real economy and the zombie corporations buying back shares. Financial elites are doing extremely well, but it doesn't look like capitalism, more like feudalism. Also, I'm not saying that capitalism has disappeared. So, you know, I think that description is quite close to what different ones of us have said. It's a realignment of where the capitalist class is operating and how. We've only got a few minutes left, but I really want to ask my last question, which just touches on XR, but it's not really about XR. And it's really, the question is, should we try to do more crime? And I wanted to frame it by like there were quite an intensive set of battles on the left about XR techniques, which were about courting arrest and who could court arrest and what the lobbying and political theatre of being arrested were. But of course, across the global left, there have been different organised and unorganised use of law breaking as part of movement building. And I wondered if, as final thoughts, any of you could say some things about what forms of law breaking might be a useful part of building an anti-capitalist movement. And I guess, are there any kinds of law breaking that are not? I'm going to ask Kevin first.
I mean, obviously, for the benefit of anybody watching, we're not encouraging anybody to be going out and doing anything from this panel. I think probably the answer is that quite often what you talked about doing crime is essentially outside of your control, because eventually any effective action that challenges the state runs the risk of arrests, and that's in the context of where we are now. You know, and if you're in a far more repressive country where pretty much anything that you do is criminalized, then everything that you're doing is a crime. But you raised the particular moment that we're in, and I think there is a debate that you've acknowledged, which is around the idea that courting arrest is a positive tactic. It's a decision, and it's a decision that some individuals have made in organizations, and Netpol generally doesn't get into the business of criticizing those groups, because we support anybody who's basically facing oppressive policing. But I do think it's worth also acknowledging that for those people who do any work with the criminal justice system will know that the realities of being arrested, of detention, of prosecution, and being imprisoned are that it's a really, really horrendous experience. And there are the potentially huge negative impacts for those people being involved. I mean, I understand that this argument about the critical mass of arrests in order to be able to force change, but there are numerous examples over the last century, at least, certainly going back further, of movements where mass arrests are absolutely decimated those movements' ability to organise. And arrest isn't just the only aspect of this. I mean, we haven't mentioned this yet, but there's also the active disruption of the state through surveillance, which is reflected in part by the ongoing and absolutely car crash undercover policing inquiry that's been going on since 2015, and which seems to never be ending, but at least is beginning to, it has flagged up at least the extent to which criminalizing by the state just doesn't involve arresting people. It's also all the other things that go on in the background, you know. So I think there's quite often there is a naivety about the ability, about the whole critical mass of people that is needed to be able to change things, because I think it very much depends on the particular circumstances of a country where that movement's being organized, you know. So if you're faced with the kind of repression that you might get in, I don't know, say in Russia at the moment, where people going out to just hold up a sign are being arrested, you're in a much more difficult position to be able to, and where people disappear, it's much more difficult to be able to build that momentum, you know. So I don't think it's a simple, it isn't a simple answer, but I think the reality is that the more that the state becomes repressive, the more you suddenly don't have a choice about whether you're a criminal, because you increasingly become more criminalized.
No, thanks so much for that. Scarlet, I wondered if you had any last thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think just reflecting on the context that Kevin's outlined there, and also thinking about the sort of specifics of the British context, my feeling is that there's there's space between, on the one hand, saying we should absolutely not be doing any sort of crime, no more crime as part of our resistance tactics, no, stay away from that, and on the other, calling for, you know, strategic kind of blanket calls for a strategy of getting like everyone arrested, and without careful reflection on differences in historical experiences of police violence, etc., etc. So I think for me there's a kind of like a lot of space in between those two positions, and maybe opportunities or openings for maybe pushing at the boundaries of doing crime, whilst carefully thinking about or trying to minimize the harm and disproportionate impact on those most at risk when participating in illegal forms of direct action. And then also maybe, and this is not going to sound that radical, but I do feel that maybe we don't fully make the most of or exploit opportunities for forms of disruption that are not, as of yet, technically illegal. You know, I'm just thinking of a supposedly public meeting that was held in Manchester recently on the police precept. So this was the proposal to increase council tax for Greater Manchester residents in order to fund more police officers. And it was a meeting involving lots of councillors and different representatives and Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester. And this supposedly public meeting, no one knew about. It was not advertised. It was in the back of this conference hall at 4 p.m. on a Monday, right? But once we got wind of this and that this thing was happening, we turned up and we were allowed, you know, technically we were allowed to be there. We were members of the public, and it was technically a public meeting, and we disrupted the meeting to some extent. You know, whether or not that will be helpful in the long run, we'll have to see. But I think the point is that there feels like there are opportunities for that sort of disruption, but you're still, you know, that we might exploit more. Yeah, if that makes sense.
No, thanks so much. Yes, it did very much. So, and the last word to Michael. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think I would start by, I think, hopefully explicitly making a point that I think the others have touched on. I mean, even the notion of doing more crime is replete with a whole intersection of privileges, right? You know, if you're black or brown, and especially if you know you're looking at the risk of being taken to a police station, you know, that's not a decision that you don't have. There is no choice there. You don't glibly, no, I don't mean glibly, but you can't freely say that, because your exposure in those circumstances is fatally higher potentially, right? That, you know, the deaths in custody statistics are one thing, but also look at the use of force statistics. You know, all the way through the process, if you get charged, you're more likely to be prosecuted. If you're prosecuted, you're more likely to be imprisoned. Now, that doesn't mean to say that those aren't decisions that individuals can't make, but I think if that is a call that you're making, it has to be made with an understanding of that context. And a similar point is that there are also communities who don't have a choice about whether they're committing a crime, because the state has decided, in effect, that their way of life is a crime. And I think about the Gypsy Roma traveller communities who have been consistently persecuted by a whole succession of governments, but a level of persecution which, if the police crime and sentencing bill goes through, will be on almost astronomical levels. You know, where we live in a country at the moment where mainstream journalists can write articles about the need to squeeze people's way of life because they don't respect it and they think it's abnormal. You know, those communities, they're not doing crime. They're not choosing to do crime. Their existence has been rendered criminal. You know, and that's the power of the state, and that's the power of a government with the majority that this one has. Having said all of that, rather than doing more crime, for me, it's be more resistant, do more resistance. You know, and the way that it's being, you know, the kind of the chant that is moving a lot in cop watch circles, and I think probably started with Sisters Uncut, which has become ungovernable. You know, there are a whole range of ways in which we can resist things that are happening. You know, and becoming ungovernable is part of a strategy to resist the Policing Crime and Courts Bill, because the reality of Parliament at the moment is that the majority of it will get passed. And so it's about, well, what do we do to resist the bill once it goes in? It's about becoming ungovernable. It's about not giving in the space to protest. You know, it's about standing in solidarity with those communities that are being expressly targeted by the legislation. You know, so we can do that we can do that. And, you know, the history of those who have fought struggles before us is replete with forms of civil disobedience, people who've had to give up their liberty, people who've had to give up their lives. That is, or certainly has been, part of the struggle. We don't have to embrace that gleefully. We recognise that as a potential reality. But there are so many things that we can be doing if we're collectively strong enough and brave enough to do it.
Thanks so much. I'm going to bring Kevin in, but I just wanted to say, I know I often sound facetious, but I'm trying to reference in the Do More Crime the kind of be gay and do crime, which is both a joke, but is also a comment on the being made illegal in your very being. And so there's a kind of play even across the range of resistant identities and communities about of what it means to be ungovernable if you're already made criminal in your being. And I think, you know, I am facetious, but I don't want you to not think that I'm not referencing someone. But I think I'm going to bring Kevin in for last word.
What Michael said, I think that, and the whole ungovernable thing does kind of then go into the idea of making the law unenforceable. And I think the important thing to remember in this, and this is also touches on what you've just said, is that people break the law all the time. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily arrested for it. In the event that we are going to try and make the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill act as eventually becomes unenforceable, part of that will be putting enormous pressure on the police and the ones who are making decisions to use those powers, and using that kind of tentative idea that they cling on to about the need to be acting with consent, or the consent of the public, in order to be able to do so, to push back against that. I mean, the obvious thing would be making it incredibly difficult for the police to be able to use their powers to target Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities just by the sheer level of solidarity that people organise in the areas where those things happen. I think that's probably what Michael was saying, right? And that also expands out to all kinds of different other areas. I've been on loads of demonstrations where people break the law all the time and they don't get arrested. And partly that's because there are just so many people breaking the law, there's just not enough cops to arrest everybody. There are tactics that we're going to have to think, and some of that, I think, does mean putting pressure on those who are making decisions to use those powers to make it very difficult politically and in terms of public pressure about using them. And I think that's something we're going to have to consider over the next sort of couple of years.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a wonderful place to end this session and the whole series. And although I don't normally say anything at the end because it's the finale, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for coming to Scarlet, Kevin and Michael today. You're all wonderful. And I thought this a really wonderful ending to the series because it was reflecting not only on how we understand capitalism, but how we think about our own survival and futures. So I hope people at home who are watching it now or in the future do think something to hold on to there, some little tips. And I hope to see you all again in some other space. I normally say, see you in the streets sometime. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. I mean, this was an incredible series, but particularly incredible discussion. And in some ways, it accidentally so happened that this took on a very different meaning to discuss today. And obviously, having Kevin, Scarlet, and Michael, I think it was an incredible way to end these series. Obviously, it's not an end to the events we do at the Left Book Club, but the events we will all do together, I hope. Yeah, I mean, please continue to stay tuned with Left Book Club events, but also particularly the Cop Watch groups that all the guests have spoken about that are popping up around the country. Get involved if you can, where you can, or set one up if it's already not in your area, and get involved in organizing and being on the streets. I think that's going to be more and more crucial as time goes by this year. So just to wrap up, please visit leftbookclub.com if you want to become a member. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Our next event is going to be on the 10th of March, so Thursday, 10th of March, and it's going to be discussing Andrea Diatri's book Bread and Roses. That'll be at 7 p.m. So please stay tuned and look at our social media accounts to see how to register. And again, thank you very much, Kevin, Scarlet, Michael, but also a special thank you for Gargi for being the mind behind this series and also preparing such incredible questions and making for such interesting and useful, I suppose, in some ways, more crucially, useful questions and discussions throughout the last 10 events that we've done together, and I'm sure we'll do more. So thank you very much, Gargi, and thank you very much for everyone who has tuned in.